Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at question and answer skills and basically equipping you with the means that you require in order to be able to answer questions effectively. And basically we're going to go through a number of different types of questions. We're going to go through complex questions and we're going to go through basically all the processes and strategies that comes from basically starting to go through the question and then just keep on going from there. Okay, so what we're looking at in this one is we're going to be looking at understanding complex questions. Now these are basically questions which are pretty much confusing and difficult. Now when I say confusing and difficult, these are questions that quite often you may find that you will get and you're sort of going, what is it asking me to do? And I go, oh, what do I do? What do I do? So this is why you basically got to have a strategy in mind and have a way of being able to break down the questions rather than just panic and go, I don't know what they're asking me to do, so I'm going to argue the point with someone. Now, arguing the point may get you somewhere, but it's not always going to be an effective strategy. And so having practice being able to interpret these sorts of questions is always handy. So it's basically that conundrum of what to do. Now, what we're going to look at with this what to do is basically as I said, the process of breaking it down. All right, so when I say the process of breaking it down, it's basically so you understand the question. And that's basically what the entire breaking down process is for. And we'll also go through some bad questions. Now, I'll admit these are bad questions, and questions which are confusing and difficult are bad questions. They shouldn't be. However, they do come up, and often, and you have to understand this, is because some questions that you get, it may be a lack of understanding on your part, it may just be a confusing question on the part of the teacher, but still, you should be able to use enough of your common sense and nous to be able to go through and have some strategies in mind to be able to answer them. I mean, you're not going to get a mark for complaining about it, so I would start by basically just looking at some strategies. All right. So, and as I said, these are bad questions. They are confusing or misleading questions that often do come up. And you have to basically keep these sorts of questions in mind and be able to respond to them in any way you choose. They do come up. And as I said, as much as teachers try to avoid giving you confusing questions, they still do come up. And so while you don't want to be blaming anyone for them, you still need to, as I said, have strategies for it. And especially if the language of the question is something that it's a lack of understanding on your part, as in you're not familiar with the concept, it's not something you studied all that hard, it's whatever it may be. It may be just simply that the question is not something that's part of the syllabus normally, or not part of at least the course that you're doing, but it's still part of the syllabus. So it's still part of the curriculum and still part of the things that you can be assessed on, even though you may not have necessarily covered it in class. So you need to be able to work it out through that sort of means as well, and to be able to use what common sense and what basically assumed knowledge you have available to be able to answer it. You need to develop a strategy, and that's what I said. So, and complaining is not a strategy, so I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to repeat it for the last time, that it's not a strategy, so basically you need to have something in mind. All right. So let's look at the first question here. So question A, and I'll read it out to you. And it says, explain how the dialogue used within text X contributes to an understanding one's personality with reference to at least 3 different characters. Now, the problem with that is that basically the understanding of one's personality seems to be referring to us, which we don't want it to be doing. Now, when we're saying referring to us, the question's not referring to us directly, and it's clearly not meant to. So that's what we're looking at to start with. We've got a question that's basically asking us to refer to a text, but also asking us to refer to our own personality, when it's clearly not what the question is trying to ask. So, what do you do? Well, to answer it, you need to actually think about really who. So who this one is that they're referring to. So, and state that basically who you believe they are in your introduction. All right. So let me just break it down into simpler terms. If you're asked a question like that, and it sort of throws up this this sort of characters, one personality. Now, it's not a good question because of that fact, and that it's basically because it's just asking you to refer to personality in general. It's hard to define what they're actually referring to, and particularly if you're referring to the text in 3 different characters, you're sort of going, well, who are they actually referring to? All right, but basically, what you need to do is you need to sort of say, define what that personality is, and maybe three traits that they have in common, one element of someone's personality that a person could have, whatever it may be. That's what your introduction's for. If the question is a little bit vague or a little bit doesn't necessarily point you in the right direction, make sure it does. Okay, so in other words, that even though I have a question which is confusing, I'm still going to point it towards my answer, and no matter what I do, I'm going to be pushing it straight towards there, and that's what I'm looking for. So if you're not sure about the question, make sure that you're still pointing towards the answer anyway, because that's what's going to help you. Okay, let's move on. So this is the next question, and I'll read it out to you again. Discuss how the falling action resulting from the climax of text X creates tension between the notions of honor and power. All right. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad question per se. It's more to do with the fact that you need to really know your techniques. Now, in the case of this is basically a story structure technique. So when we're talking about it in terms of being a story structure technique, then you need to be familiar with the quite, basically the very concrete form of text structure. Now, when you're referring to the concrete form of text structure, basically what you're doing is you're referring to the fact that all texts have rising actions and then falling actions and the climax in the middle. All right. So basically, you can actually pretty much work it out. Now, you also need to work out what is meant by tension. And there's this idea, it's a very sort of vague word. Does it sort of create a conflict, perhaps? And why doesn't it just say conflict? It says tension. So again, it's one of the things that you need to define in your introduction. Okay, you can also guess, and if you're not sure what a falling action or a climax is at the beginning, then basically what you can do is you can essentially look at it and go, okay, is there a common sense way to be able to do this? Can I just basically go from what there is and what information I have to be able to answer it? So that is, if the climax is at the top, then the falling action must be coming down. So you can use common sense to be able to decipher that question. However, and this is the big however, and I'll just rub this off first, and this isn't always possible. And the reason it isn't always possible is because the techniques that you may refer to, you won't be able to decipher just through using common sense. All right, so it's essential that you go through basically checklists of text and language techniques once in a while, just to make sure that if you do get something that refers directly to a language technique and one that you're not sure of, that you're able to identify it and identify how it's used. Now, questions like this don't necessarily come up very often, but they do come up, and especially they're the ones that, if they're referring to a technique, they often unstick the ones who haven't really prepared or don't really have a solid understanding of what different grammatical terms are or different language techniques are. So it's always good to just peruse at your leisure every now and then a couple of checklists just to make sure that you're sort of up to speed on what sort of language techniques you may be tested on. And if you're able to then discuss it and be able to interpret it, that's even better. All right, let's look at the next question. Now, we've got a very interesting and very tough question here. This is probably one of the toughest of the lot here, which is that latitude and perspectives being embraced referred to nothing specific. As in, if we're looking at the question, I'll read the question out, explain how the persona's latitude in text X culminates in a variety of perspectives being embraced. I mean, what does that refer to? It's almost gibberish. Now, you could basically define those as a number of different things, and because they're so vague, you can basically put your own definition down, and that's basically what we're looking for. Again, the key thing here, and I haven't highlighted it there, but I'll highlight it here, which is your introduction. Your introduction is where you basically sort out, if the question is difficult to understand, what your definition of the question is. Now, that's part of the battle when you're writing a response, an extended response or a short response or otherwise, is basically saying, I know what the question's asking me. And if I'm not sure, then I'm going to say at least what I think the question's asking me. Because no matter what you do, whether you understand the question or not, you need to first of all rephrase it, and second of all define it. As in rephrase it so you can write it in words that are more conducive to your response, and then define it, as in to say that this is my main point and this is the reason why I define it this way. So in your introduction, you can basically define these however you choose. Now, in this case, as I said, you have to do a bit of the work yourself. In other words, to say that latitude is sort of revolving around perhaps their ways of thinking, and it might mean that they're sort of going off in different tangents, different directions, and perspectives being embraced. Okay, so it might mean that there are a number of different personas on show, who knows? All right, depends on the text. I mean, we're using a mythical text X here, so we're not sure, but if we have something like that where there are a number of different personas, then we can probably guess, based on what the wording is, that that's what the question is asking us. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, which is, before we do that, that we have to remember that vague questions don't have to have vague answers. Now, that's an important thing to remember, that if you get a vague question like this, that you don't have to have a vague answer to go with it. So if I was to answer the question and I was going to say that something happens in this text and it does something to something, really vague like that, not necessarily saying your answers are going to be that vague, but it does mean that you're essentially not really going into anything specific with the question. All right. You must show that you're also able to be specific, even if the question you've been given is not specific. And just because a question is a bad question doesn't mean you have to give a bad answer to it. So remember that. All right, now we'll move on to question D. Okay, now this question is almost deliberately confusing, and I'll read the question out to you, which is, explain how the author's use of style is facilitated by the context in which the text was composed and the influence this has on an understanding of its world. All right, so it's a very long-winded question. It's a very wordy question, and it almost seems to ask you a number of different things, when really, if you actually break it down, it's actually a lot easier. And this is actually not so much a bad question as it is a very long-worded question. All right, so what you have to do is now split it up and do your best to work it out yourself. And basically, we'll look at it in two parts. So for the first part, we're going to look at this: the author's style being facilitated by its context. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, we can say by context, we sort of mean about the time it's written. And facilitate, it means basically it's given. So the style is given by the time it's written. So basically, we're then referring to, if we were to sort of use a different choice of words, we'll say the style of the era, or basically the way that people wrote at the time. So facilitate just basically is suggesting that the time provides a style. As in, if you're writing in a particular era, for instance, a romantic era, then more than likely you're going to write in a romantic style, because that's what the trend is. Now, if you're looking at it in the modern context, there aren't that many the modern trend of writing is fairly loose and experimental and all the rest, and there aren't really set or solid ways of writing, as there probably were in the 1800s or even earlier. So there's no strict structure. So the context is probably referring to an older text if you're looking at it this way. All right, let's move on to the second part. And the second part basically refers to this: the influence. Okay, so the influence this has on our understanding of its world. Now, because this question is about context and about the time it was written, then basically you would say that this relates to a number of things. Now, because we're talking about its world, and we're talking about it in terms of the text, and we're talking about the world in terms of the text and not the world in which it was written. However, what we can say is basically how the time period and how the style of how people wrote at that particular time influences basically the world of the story. So essentially what we can rephrase the question as, and if we'll make it simpler, is this: is basically how the style of the era, apologise for my bad handwriting, influences the story and its world, basically. And in my introduction now, I would include that, because that's my definition. That's what I understand the question to mean. So if I was to go on, then I can basically start talking about this and then start to link it back to some of those other keywords. All right. So this strategy is not without risk, and this is something I do want to make clear, is that you must really make sure that you rephrase the question properly and try and use keywords from the question where we can. Now in this case, I gave you a very much a layman's term definition, but what you should be doing is you should be finding some keywords from the question which you can still put in there. All right, so have it in your head as a very simple idea first, and then go back and use bits from the question to be able to supplement it further. All right. Now, what else can you do? If none of these strategies work, what else can you do? In the exam, not much. Unfortunately, that's just the luck of the draw, and you may get that from time to time. Treat it as a learning experience. Treat it as something that you know for next time that this is how I would do this question. Look at the feedback that you get from your teacher, or even take it up with them afterwards and just ask, what did that question actually ask me to do? Is it a fault on my part, or is it a fault on the fact that the question was confusing? Do it respectfully. I mean, don't do it in the way where you argue and plead, because that's not going to help you. I mean, you're responsible as it is for your own learning, and having that responsibility, you need to be able to ask those sorts of questions and be able to ask, how can I improve myself? So this is basically what I mean. Now, just keep calm and do your best. Don't panic. That's the big thing to do, especially on the exam. And I know it's a temptation, because every time a student comes up to me and says, I got a confusing question, I ask what they do, and did they panic? And they go, yes. So don't panic. All right, it's not the end of the world, and especially unless it is actually your HSC, there is time to make up for it. All right, so just keep calm, as I said, and do your best. If it's for an assignment, however, then you ask your best resource you have available, your teacher. You politely, again, make sure it's polite, ask them to explain, and they'll explain it to you. Make sure you do that. Don't just leave it till the night before and go, oh, maybe I should ask. No, make sure you ask them straight away. The first thing you should do before you tackle any assessment is make sure you understand the question, because if you don't, then it's going to make the question the assessment very hard to do. And knowing the question is basically, as I said, almost as important as what you write. Because once you understand it, you'll really know what you are supposed to be writing. And if you're writing a whole heap of things that are answering a number of different things which you think the question might entail, you're not actually going to go towards answering the question at all. So you need to be very clear on what it's asking. And on that note, that's about all I can advise on how to understand a complex question. So the simplest strategy is to keep calm, to relax, to break it down as much as you can, and if you're able to, ask someone for help. And that's basically it. So until next time, I'll see you later.